Welcome to the Exchange Server 2016 Infrastructure course. This course is part of a four-part series on Exchange Server 2016. This first course covers the infrastructure and the dependencies of Exchange. The other courses will do client access because you want clients to connect to your Exchange server, the Mailbox database because you want to store mail on your Exchange servers, and transport because you want to send mail to other people. But this course will focus on Exchange infrastructure. But first, let me tell you a little bit about ourselves. So, my name is Martin Kutzer, with me is Joe. I'm a content developer at Microsoft Learning Experiences. I specialize in Exchange, Skype for Business, and Office 365 training. And I'm an MCSA in Office 365 and also messaging and communications. I've got about 20 years of experience in the IT. I was a consultant that deployed these technologies, and I'm really honored to have Joe with me that co-authored the Exchange 2016 course with me. So, Joe, tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Martin. I'm Joe Turick. I'm a consultant with Olive & Goose. I've been with Olive & Goose for probably a year, and prior to that, I was with Microsoft as well. I was with Microsoft for about 16 years in Exchange Server support, primarily supporting things like Outlook Web App, which is now Outlook on the web, Exchange ActiveSync, Outlook connectivity, things like that. So that's what I specialized in for about almost 16 years. I wore many hats during that time. I was a beta engineer for the Exchange 2007, where I was exposed to Autodiscover and helped write the infamous Autodiscover white paper.
Oh, so it's your fault.
It's my fault, yes. Wrote a couple other white papers. I think, do you remember Conferencing Server?
Yeah, I remember that.
Conferencing Server, I wrote a couple papers on those. But so right now I'm doing mostly technical writing as a consultant with Olive & Goose, and I'm looking forward to talking about Exchange 2016.
Wow, cool. So, yeah, guys, you're in good hands. So let's get started. This course is Exchange Server 2016 Infrastructure. And I just want to tell everybody that this course is a part of a edX course that we're going to have available. And if you go to that link on screen, you'll be able to take this course online and go into a lot of the detail. So today we're going to cover the Exchange Server requirements and prerequisites. We're going to talk about deployment. How do you manage your Exchange Server? How do you manage recipient objects? How do you mail enable those permissions? And then we're going to go into public folders, they're still around. And we're going to talk about your plan and configure administrative security and auditing. So this is what this course is about. And this first module is going to be prerequisites and requirements. So just to set the expectations, we want you to be a person that is interested in Exchange Server 2016. If you came to this course to learn about Skype for Business, or if you want to learn about SharePoint, then you're in the wrong place. So click away. But if you're interested in Exchange Server 2016 and Office 365, because a lot of the things that you're going to learn here, you can also use in Office 365. Yep. So then you're in the right place. But we need you to know a couple of things before you can start this course. Obviously, we want you to know what is Windows Server. You must have installed the Windows Server before, and you need to know how AD works, DNS works, networking, like those kind of things, because we're going to talk about these concepts, and if you don't know how those things work, then that just might fly over your head. So this is part of our expectations. This is an MVA course, so if you are part of the MVA community, great. You are part of 3 million people that are online and learning about Microsoft and how to deploy our technology. So check it out. There's lots more courses on MVA. So let's get started with our first course on Exchange prerequisites and requirements. So in this module, we want to talk about the introduction of Exchange Server, talk a little bit about the differences in 2016, how is it different from 2013, and the requirements on Active Directory. We also want to cover the hardware and software requirements, and that is a science and an art when we talk about the software requirements, because when we do hardware and software requirements, we have to make sure that It works well with your environment, but you need to know a lot about your environment to really come up with a good specification.
Sure.
If you don't know what your environment looks like, then you're going to sort of do the wrong thing. And so it's important to make sure that you know your requirements, what your users are doing, so that you can come up with the right hardware and software requirements. And then the first thing that you're going to do when you set up your Exchange environment is you're going to get your Active Directory ready. So we're going to talk about that as well. So let's go into the Active Directory integration first. So when you set up your Active Directory, you need to know that Exchange is heavily dependent on Active Directory. It's been more than a decade where Exchange is dependent on Active Directory.
Yeah. That was 5.5, I think.
Yeah, the last version that was, a previous millennium that had
its own directory.
Its own directory,
right.
Yeah.
And so I think Exchange 2000 was when we came out with Windows Server 2000, which was our first exposure to Active Directory.
Yeah, and ever since that time, we now have a dependency on Active Directory for Exchange to run. So the interface that talks to the Active Directory from the Exchange point of view is the Active Directory driver. That driver is the thing that makes sure that it can talk to the Active Directory.
The successor to DS Access.
Okay, so there was a service in Exchange called MS Exchange DS Access, and now it's the Active Directory driver. So you'll see that as one of the services if you're into that kind of thing and you want to monitor your services. So there's specific Active Directory requirements that we can talk about, and DNS requirements as well, that is important to know about Exchange when you run Exchange. So let's talk about these Active Directory requirements. So as we said, Active Directory is a really important component in Exchange. And if you have your Active Directory up and running and healthy, which means what? If Active Directory is healthy, it's basically replicating. It's healthy. There's no orphan objects in your Active Directory and so on. Exchange uses the Active Directory in terms of the forest to store its configuration. There's a one-to-one relationship in your Active Directory with the forest. So if you have one forest, then that means you have one Exchange organization. If you have two forests, that means that you're going to have at least one or maybe two Exchange organizations. So
the only exception to that might be if you're in a hybrid where you also have an Exchange Online tenant. So you might have one in on-premises, one Active Directory forest with Exchange on-premises, yet you might also have a tenant in Exchange Online. That would be probably the only exception to that rule.
Yeah. And it's because Exchange and the AD Connect allows you to synchronize the two. You're sort of mimicking one forest, and so it appears as one Exchange organization. You also need to know about the schema. The schema is where Exchange creates its classes and attributes. So obviously Exchange extends the Active Directory schema so that it can store its configuration in Active Directory. So things like a Exchange server object, a database object, SMTP object, those things are schema changes that needs to be done on your Active Directory so that Exchange can store those configuration objects in Exchange. And it stores it in the configuration partition on your Active Directory. The configuration partition is a partition that is replicated to all the domain controllers, any domain controller in any domain in your Active Directory. And so Exchange servers has access to that configuration because it's on all the domain controllers.
In a simple form, would it be safe to say that any setting that you change using Exchange Management Shell or anything that you change in Exchange Admin Center, whether it be a connector or a modification of a user property, all of that is stored in Active Directory somewhere?
Exactly. Anything, that configuration is stored in Active Directory. Exchange doesn't have its own storage. It will use the Active Directory to store that configuration in. It also stores some of its configuration in a domain because you create users, a user is associated with a mailbox, so that configuration is stored on the user object in Active Directory. So it uses the domain as well. And then finally, we have the global catalog. The global catalog is that read-only version of the directory. So every domain controller keeps a copy if it's assigned to be a global catalog. It makes a read-only copy of necessary attributes that it needs to that domain controller, and it's then on all the domain controllers that's part of the forest. It doesn't matter which domain it is, so that it can be able to resolve names that is in other domains.
Any Exchange object with an email address.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so therefore, it's got that information on hand when it needs to do a message route and find out, where do I send this mail to? Because this user is not in my local domain, but it's maybe in another domain.
Or when a user is addressing a mail and needs to find a person in the address book, all that information is stored in the global catalog is responsible for doing that as well.
Yep. So the global catalog is a really important concept as part of your Active Directory as well that Exchange will use to access. So then we also have DNS requirements.
DNS is really important. If DNS isn't working, then Exchange isn't working. Exchange relies on several different types of DNS records, service resource records. They're used to identify the characteristics of your servers in your environment, whether this is a domain controller or this is a DNS server or whatever it is. Host records are important because that's important for mapping your host names to IP addresses for general connectivity. Then you have MX records, which identify the servers in your domain who are responsible for receiving and sending mail for that specific domain. And not quite as common as those three records are SPF records, which come to play in Sender.
The Sender Provider Framework.
Thank you. I should have known SPF. Yeah. So very important to Exchange functionality.
Yeah. So you could almost think about DNS as sort of the framework that AD runs on, and Exchange runs on AD again. So if DNS is not working, AD is not going to work. And if AD is not running, then Exchange is not going to work. So the three are so interlinked, without the one, the other one is definitely not going to work. So you need to make sure that all these things are up and running and healthy. And if there's something wrong with your DNS, then fix that. Don't look at Exchange. Fix your DNS.
Yes.
Before you look at the Exchange issues. Okay. So that concludes some of the requirements in Exchange. So next we're going to talk about the hardware requirements and the software requirements of Exchange. So what do you need to run Exchange in your environment? So in terms of the hardware requirements, we have to really, again, specify that hardware requirements is kind of tricky because if you're a 5-user company, your hardware requirements is going to be a lot less than a company that's got thousands and thousands of users. Maybe you're a big international bank and you have hundreds of thousands of users, then you're going to have different hardware requirements. So with hardware, what we recommend is that you use a spreadsheet that you download from the Microsoft website. It's the Exchange Server Role Requirements Calculator, and that will give you the opportunity to find out what your hardware requirements. But let me just say a couple of things. The minimum RAM required for Exchange is 8 gigs of RAM. So if you have a machine that's got less than 8 gigabytes of RAM, then I would not recommend that you run Exchange on that machine because it's going to be dog slow. So don't do that. In terms of CPU requirements, it needs to be a 64-bit CPU. It needs to be capable of running 64-bit operations. If it's not 64-bit capable, then it will not be able to run Exchange. So that's not really a problem because when we get into the software requirements, you'll see that all the operating systems that supports Exchange is 64-bit only. But if you were thinking, oh, I have this old server that's not doing a lot, and I decommissioned the application that was running on it, I'm going to reuse that server to run my Exchange on, then you have to make sure that that server is 64-bit capable. It needs to have that instruction set to run 64-bit operation. It's because we need that memory capability to do the 64-bit operations. So that basically is the hardware requirements. So, Joe, tell us about the software requirements.
There's definitely some specifics with regards to software. Exchange 2016 is only supported when running on Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. That's the standard or the data center versions. Prerequisites include the Microsoft .NET Framework 4.5.2. The Windows Management Framework 4.0 or later, and the recommendation there is that you use the version of the framework that's bundled with the operating system. RSAT for Active Directory Domain Services, and Microsoft Unified Communications Managed API. Those are the prerequisites. The management tools are not limited to 2012 or 2012 R2, either standard or data center. You can also run those on the 64-bit version of Windows 8.1 and Windows 10.
Okay, so there's a bit more flexibility when it comes to the management.
Just to the management, right?
Okay. Well,
it's probably also important to note that Exchange does need to run on the full version of Windows. It's not supported to run it on the core, the server core mode.
Okay. Wow. Oh, great.
Which makes sense.
Okay, so that concludes our software and hardware requirements of Exchange Server 2016. So next thing that you need to know when you install Exchange Server is you need to prepare your Active Directory for Exchange. And that's where you actually extend the schema and you add new objects or classes in your schema. And those classes are associated with attributes. So for example, when you create the SMTP connector, that allows you to send mail to somebody else, you can then associate that configuration item in Active Directory. But before it can create that object, it needs to have the ability, the schema or the definition, that's the class of that object. So the first thing that you need to do before you can install Exchange Server 2016 is you need to extend the schema. So extending the schema means that you need to be a schema administrator. A schema administrator is the only role inside of your Exchange servers or inside of your Active Directory that is allowed to extend the schema. If you're not a schema administrator, then you wouldn't be able to do that. So if you're in one of those organizations where you have a lot of role separation, and they are strict about who can extend the schema, and you have to get to change control first and apply and so on, then you may only be, may need to be a schema admin for the installation, the first installation of the first server, so that you can extend the schema, and then after that you can be removed from that group again. So it's something that you need to be aware of. Then if you're installing your first Exchange server, maybe you're one of those organizations that used another mail system and you now going to implement Exchange for the first time, you need to prepare your Active Directory so it creates that container in the configuration partition for the first time so that it can store the server configuration in that container. And to be able to do that, you need to be an enterprise admin, because the enterprise admin will have the necessary permissions to write to the configuration container. So to prepare your Active Directory, you need to do that as well. And then finally, you need to prepare your Active Directory domains as well. So to prepare your Active Directory domains, this gives the Exchange servers the necessary permissions to write into your domain. So when you create a mailbox, it needs to update the user object with an email address and a mailbox database value and all the attributes that is associated with that user. Maybe that user's got an archive mailbox or something like that. So the Exchange servers will do those operations. And so the Exchange servers needs permissions inside of your domain to be able to do that. And you may want to do that in a staged way where you're going to assign those permissions to one domain and then to a next domain, or if you're running a small environment, you want to do that in one go.
And if it's a small environment where you only have one domain, that's already handled when you're preparing the forest, correct?
Yeah.
You wouldn't have to prepare the domain separately then.
Yeah. So when you want to do these operations, there's some infrastructure requirements that you need to do to extend your schema. So the schema itself must be running on a Windows Server 2008 R2 or Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2 machine. Anything before that, like a Windows 2003 machine, is not supported. And Exchange will see that and it will stop installing. It will give you a warning and say, you have to move your schema to a schema master to a 2008 machine. You also must have a global catalog that must be running Windows Server 2008 R2 or later, any of those later versions on that machine, so that Exchange has access to those machines. And then finally, your domain level and forest functional level must be on 2008 as well. This is currently the supported version of domain functional levels and forest functional levels. If you are still running 2003 functional levels on your domain side and your forest side, then that means you're out of support. And if you phone Microsoft support, then they're going to tell you, well, this is a scenario that we're not really sure works, and we're going to insist that you upgrade your domain functional level to 2008, and which means you need to get rid of all your 2003 domain controllers, upgrade them to a 2008 level, and then also switch that functional level in Active Directory. So it's a one-time operation. It's one of those things that when you do it, you can't undo it. So when you switch to a new forest functional level, that will be your functional level. So Exchange will insist that is in place to make sure that you are supported.
Yes.
If you're not in a supported fashion, you're going to get into a scenario where people are going to see that it's not tested, and therefore there could be problems. Again, DNS must be working. Your Exchange server will do name resolution of servers, domain controllers, and so on. So it needs access to DNS servers so that it will be able to connect to the AD and do the configuration changes and so on, and do that name resolution operations. To install the Exchange environment, here's a couple of quick hints for setting up Exchange. So you have prepare AD. This is where it sets up the configuration container. This is where you have to specify organization name when you prepare AD. And you also have prepare schema if you want to prepare the schema specifically. And then the prepare domain name specific domain, or / prepare all domains. So if you're in an environment where you want to do these things in a piecemeal fashion, then you will run prepare schema first to extend the schema, and you will run prepare AD to prepare your Active Directory, and then prepare domain to prepare the domains one by one. But if you don't want to do this and you have the necessary permissions and you run setup the first time, Exchange will see, the schema is not extended, and it will try to extend the schema, and then at that point you need to be a schema master. So that wraps up our first module on Exchange Server 2016 infrastructure, and we want you to stay around and check in with our next module on managing Exchange 2016.